As you know, there was a terrible mechanism of humiliation and extermination in the death camps. Many methods were used. Imagination draws men committing atrocities. Despite that, there were also special camps for purely female prisoners. In such places, Aryan ladies were more than active, but the most inhuman was the one who was not even a warden. She reveled in power in the Buchenwald camp, being the wife of its commandant. Who is she? The most terrible woman of the Third Reich. And what did she do that she became infamous? Welcome to Explore History. Today's topic will be dedicated to a woman named Ilse Koch and her unforgivable deeds. Short biography. Ilse Koch was born in the culturally vibrant city of Dresden on 22nd of September 1906. She was born in the simplest German cell of society, in a family of ordinary grey workers. In particular, her father was a worker at one of the enterprises of the mentioned settlement. Ilse was neatly built, blonde, with freckles, with rather elegant straight features. And she was indeed proud of that. Looking ahead, we will say that she was able to provide an Aryan pedigree up to the year of 1800, in order to subsequently obtain permission to marry one of the Kochs in the SS. After graduating from 8 classes of the same ordinary school, the girl went to study at a commercial school that trained accountants. She spent another 2 years there, and then she went to work in one office as an accountant. We do not know anything more from her biography until 1922. There were only gossips that she had also worked as a secretary. Apparently, one of the institutions of her work was one of the offices of the newly formed NSDAP party. But how so? It's just that in 1922, as a 16-year-old girl, she joined one of the youth units of the Nazis. There was no doubt about her conviction in the ideas of Nazism. After all, the party itself existed for just 2 years. That is, a young resident of Germany has become part of its core elements. About 10 years later, with the beginning of the process of seizing power by the National Socialists, Ilse became one of them on official level. Party membership number 1130836. During all this time, she changed several companies. Was she in reality an accommodating, aware of Aryan superiority, or was her character initially just disgusting? Most likely both the first and the second option. Personal life before the wedding and moving to Buchenwald. The young member of Hitler's party was especially well known among SS officers. 2 years after joining the Nazi community, a 28-year-old resident of Germany became the wife of one of them, a Standartenführer named Karl Otto Koch. This Hitlerite, even before being transferred to Buchenwald, near which he received a luxurious large villa and where he went to live with his wife, managed to work as a commandant in Lichtenburg. And prior to that, he ruled in one of the first 3 concentration camps, not yet death camps, Sachsenhausen. And apart from that, the Thuringian Buchenwald, which we will talk about here, is not the last place of his work. There will also be Majdanek in the vicinity of Polish Lublin. That is, Koch was the first to get used to the system of repressive institutions, having managed to understand what benefits this could bring him personally. Well, why is that? It's just that at all workplaces, his colleagues, other aggressors of the Third Reich, understood that he was prone to corruption. He was as rotten in terms of conscience as his excessively enterprising wife. Confirmation will be the further description of the fate of our gloomy leading actress. Koch and his fiancée proved their racial purity and received a permission to marry from Himmler. You already know what bureaucratic procedures both had to go through. In Buchenwald, Otto got the most satisfying position in 1937, the post of head of the newly built Buchenwald in German Thuringia, only because he attracted the attention of Himmler himself, the head of the SS service. But why did he want that? He was imbued with racial and national chauvinism, as well as ideological justifications for segregation, so much so that he was not afraid to carry out the most monstrous orders. Before the Munich Agreement, there was no conveyor belt destruction. Placement in ghettos and executions for disobedience were practiced, but no more than that. And therefore, such butcher recyclers as Koch were a rarity. They were worth their weight in gold by the Reich. Buchenwald was originally a labor camp. It was made a death factory by people like Koch, on the orders of people like Himmler. The SS service, before the disposal of the Untermensch, was only a security service, but became a political body specializing in punitive functions, in new lands, and in the functions of extermination of Untermensch, in already well-developed lands. Consequently, the male half of Koch family became one of those who were the very first in the invention of methods of humiliation, dehumanization, and subsequent economical destruction of people. Few people know, but Koch also visited the Gestapo, Reich police system before his appointment. He worked in various positions in the Dachau and Columbia House zones for political prisoners. While communicating with his life partner, he savored in detail the ways to talk to the prisoner or break the will of the prisoner, depriving him of his last human dignity he could have. She listened attentively. Of course, such a husband was happy to provide prisoners to a spoiled wife with a bad, toxic personality. She didn't want to run the household in their villa with her own hands. And why it's needed, when there are thousands of Untermensch around her who could be forced to do the work of a sewage collector, a charcoal burner, a gardener, a cook, a dishwasher, a cleaner, and a maid. As you may have guessed, they were all prisoners of the said concentration camp, who could be humiliated morally as well as physically, and this was worth a lot. Self-assertion off of others for many was, is, and will be the highest happiness. Anyway, in the end, people were tortured. What do the prisoners of Buchenwald remember about Ilse? Why was the main person of this plot called the Witch of Buchenwald? It was for her guests and the Aryan staff that she was a bright, especially fashionable society lady. But in the eyes of any prisoners of the camp, she was a moral monster. The first prisoners of Buchenwald were not Jews at all. They, together with the Gypsies, began to concentrate in huge areas only in 1938. The first prisoners were priests of the Church of Jehovah's Witnesses, incorrigible criminals, men and women of non-traditional sexual orientation. These groups of people were transferred here from Sachsenhausen and later from Sachsenburg and Lichtenberg, where Koch also once worked, having studied some of the prisoners, recommending them to his wife as specialists in various types of economic activity, and so on. Those two zones for repression were simply disbanded. At the same time, Buchenwald immediately expanded in size. Ilse became pregnant with a son. Artwin was born in 1938, and daughters Gisela and Gudrun in 1939 and 1940, respectively. In the process of pregnancy, the already spoiled Frau several times turned into a real fury. Considering that the youngest daughter later died of pneumonia, her mother's fuse for rage grew. And this is where we'll begin to tell the most hot part of all this material. Look more closely at what is next. In addition to the garden and fountain, there was also a zoo just 10 meters from the fence of the concentration camp. Do not forget the size of the villa itself. All this grandiose area required a small army of slaves, and soon the SS hostess, who occupied a nominal position, became too lazy to take care of her own children. Nannies and tutors were added to the army of slaves. Ilse only had time to show off fashionable outfits and woe to the one of the servants who, at least in a conversation with someone, whispered something bad about the surreal and depraved outfits of this young lady. She beat such people personally and then ordered professionals to beat these prisoners. They didn't live long afterwards. Often the reason for such a terrible disgrace was a careless look at her, or sluggishness in doing work, which the gargoyle herself complicated, in rage knocking something over on the floor, littering, or breaking dishes. There were guests, and they confirmed this kind of attitude. The worst of the witch's excesses. So why did people fear Frau Koch more than her man himself? There were rumors that she was a bloody pervert. Believers formed the rumor with the attached metaphor of fiend of hell. Walking around the camp in search of her husband, she could hit any of the local unfortunates with a whip. She set her vicious shepherd dog on people even when she was in a good mood. More to add here, she admired how an especially unfat animal gnawed a person, biting off everything that the dog could. That is, in fact, the crazy Nazi devilish being fed her dog in this way. And she also allegedly liked to inspect the space of the correctional Aryan institution on horseback and whip the prisoners in the saddle position, touching their heads more. As always, she walked in those most fashionable revealing outfits, but with the only difference that now passed the emaciated men. And for obscene looks, she demanded that the guards punish the guilty. Often the punishment was fatal. Any order of the woman had to be carried out in the same way as the order of the Standartenführer himself. The most egregious cases are under the string. At the end of the summer of 1938, on one rainy day, the prisoners were busy with planning work near Koch's house. The gargoyle watched their work from the window. Out of nowhere, the owner of the villa approached a group of workers. "You must work, you cattle, not stand," she yelled. A prisoner named Linda straightened up to scrape off his shovel the sticky earth, which stuck to the metal so much that it interfered with the work. So the prisoners returned in a column to the camp, where Linda was summoned to the parade ground. In front of the rest of the prisoners lined up, the poor man was punished with 25 strokes of the stick. Then he was still standing against the wall. A few days later, the guards hung him by his hands, which were also tied behind his back, and hanging in such a position was simply unbearable, even for people with flexible and developed musculature. It was just a favorite mockery of one of the executioners there. a young SS man Martin Sommer. He was immediately delighted when there was a reason for another execution of this kind. Sadly, Linda was not the only victim of sudden, unmotivated hatred. Once, when a lot of Jews had already arrived in the camp, another team of prisoners was dragging stones to the road that passed around the buildings where the authorities lived. The passage should have been paved better. Ilse, watching the work of the prisoners, turned to the warden by the surname of Kubitz. "Look how slowly these Jewish pigs walk," she yelled. And after this, Kubitz ordered the prisoners to carry the stones for 2 hours in a row, on the double. Many dropped them, receiving blows for this, which led to serious injuries. As a result of such physical education, some prisoners fell exhausted, unable to move a leg or arm. Those who remained on their feet had to drag them to the barracks on their backs. From 1937 to 1940, on the orders of the Koch couple, 3,500 people were eaten, bitten by dogs, to death. The bodies were immediately taken to cremation, leaving no evidence in the labor camp that this was by now a death camp. In 1940, the furnaces had to be built right on the territory of Buchenwald. There were more corpses. At the same time, in one of the cellars, the largest, a torture chamber was arranged, where a total of more than 1,000 poor souls were hung, most of them on the slander of the devil with the surname Koch. But if only that. Often people became victims not only of an intolerable character, but also of the overdeveloped entrepreneurial streak of the witch of Buchenwald. More on this later. The story of unusual leather items. Actually, in this section, this is exactly what made an ordinary housewife, Ilse Koch, and not some monster overseer from the SS, become a female symbol of the atrocities of Nazism. Many consider the scandalous story that will be revealed to you below to be poorly proven. Why did Ilse order the newcomers to take off their robes and look at their bodies? No, not for the sake of sexual experiences, although maybe that's also why. She unleashed a hunt for people with beautiful tattoos. Of course, all this remained at the level of rumors. All the victims, witnesses, and executors of what will be discussed further did not survive. Only one, but allegedly, the leather decorated with works of tattoo art, and Hitler's madam understood art and fashion, striking familiar aunts and girls, was used to make lampshades, notebooks, book bindings, covers for photo albums, folders for documents, cases for gloves, and etc. How did all of it work? The men she selected were taken somewhere, and after a while their corpses were sent to block number 2. It was a pathology department, in which the skin was carefully separated. Then it went to the tanning shop, and from there to the workshops. The skins, which Frau Koch sold for a huge price, were again produced by prisoners. Those who had previously worked in the tanneries taught the newcomers. Austrian pathologist Gustav Wegener stated under oath that he was personally involved in the separation of such beautiful skin. But whose order to remove it was in reality a mystery. Despite such a charade, it's not difficult to guess, given that Frau Koch always volunteered to inspect the newcomers. Arrest of the Koch couple by the authorities of the Third Reich. Adoring specific type of adornments, illegal accumulations, and falconry, Koch was repeatedly caught taking bribes and appropriating the valuable property of prisoners. But he got away with it until 1943. There were many reports and even official reports about the Koch family from other SS men. In particular, under Koch, material valuables disappeared. People complained about forceful extortion, and then experienced Jewish doctors who treated the SS themselves were shot. And many didn't like it when prisoners who were not Jews and Roma people, those who only had to be treated with labor, were tortured to death for no reason, at the whim of the commandant's wife. They didn't ignore the fact that the skin with those tattoos could also be not only Jewish. It turned out that the doctors knew that Koch had syphilis and even knew where it came from. That's why they died. On August 24, 1942, Otto Koch was removed from office, and the next year he was arrested altogether. A little later, the high police of the German Empire came for his wife. Koch was sentenced to death by firing squad only for the reason that one of the doctors he killed was a pure-blooded German. For everything else, he would have been in prison. Ilse was threatened with a finger and she returned to the villa. For some time she was in the villa, collecting the things accumulated here and children. And then with all this she moved to her relatives, to another city. Arrest of Ilse Koch. On 13th of April, American units entered the territory of this camp. What they saw plunged them into a violent shock. The fact is that, knowing about the approach of the enemy, the Nazis began to get rid of the prisoners with special care, shooting them en masse. They burned the corpses. Dying and exhausted people were lying everywhere. Some of them died anyway. No medical care helped. The soldiers saw the tall piles of the dead and were justifiably indignant. However, such a massacre as an infamous Dachau did not happen here. Making their way through the mountains of bodies stacked like firewood, the soldiers entered the barracks. There was no less stench here than in the crematorium or in the open areas of the camp. Everywhere there is just terrible sanitation. American General George Patton gave the order to shoot all this with cameras. The prisoners who remained on their feet conducted a tour for journalists and the military, not only in barracks themselves, but also around parade grounds and crematoria. They showed infirmaries and torture chambers, as well as places where anatomical aids made of people were stored. Organs were alcoholized, bones boiled, and heads dried. In the tannery, they found the remains of the material and a lampshade, which became an essential evidence at the trial. At the trial, the accused, named Ilse Koch, was dubbed Frau Lampshade, since the prisoners during the said tour immediately said, "Who came up with the idea of making items from human skin with tattoos?" The Americans sent a team for Ilse Koch, but she had not been in the villa for a long time. But there was a huge collection of leather things, as an addition to the lampshade from the workshop. The liberators of the camp did not find in it any of the enslavers of the innocent people. Frau Koch, knowing what awaited her, moved to Ludwigsburg, the same settlement in which she had relatives, where she could leave her children. Their mother was lacking qualities of a good mother. Here she led a quiet, or maybe habitually loud, life, but tried not to meddle in anything. She hadn't read the newspapers. Well, for her own sake she had to. There was already a photo of her in the newspapers, in articles dedicated to the horrors that she and her husband committed in Buchenwald. In the same 1945, one of the surviving victims of her aggression, a man, a former prisoner, noticed her on the streets of Ludwigsburg. She had to hide in the countryside, but this area was too unprepared for her. He traced where she had gone and gave the address to the American police. As a result, on June 30th, the witch of Buchenwald was arrested after making sure from many victims that she was exactly this woman. Materials for it were collected for a long time, until April 11th, 1947. Only on this day she was transferred from prison to the dock. Well, what was the process? Trial, acquittal, new trial, and prison. The place of trial was a room in the Dachau camp. The court staff were the US military, who organized a tribunal over war criminals who were caught in southern Germany. This redhead was the only lady among the 30 defendants. All of them were male employees of Buchenwald. It was difficult to attract her to the news, but since there were about 100 witnesses to her tragic antics, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. Though by that time she was 8 months pregnant, she cunningly got pregnant from a German soldier who was captured and with whom she shared a cell. But a woman and a man cannot share a cell. A tunnel had to be dug out of the men's block. This novella looks more like a very thought-out myth. Others suggest that she was used, by her consent of course, by a lawyer or a security guard. In any case, the death penalty no longer was awaiting her. In general, Frau Lampshade, this nickname was published in the British and American press, was released. And this caused strong public outrage. After all, some of those who were her victims were still alive. Their friends and relatives were also outraged. All of them claimed that the material of the things in the witch's production was human skin. Therefore, in 1949, the West German authorities detained Ilse Koch. 4 new witnesses during the trial claimed to have personally seen tattooed prisoners killed under the command of the officer, and then one assisted in skinning them. Moreover, these people had to work in the same workshop where lampshades were created from this skin. The criminal case was not reopened. The court did not believe the new oral testimony, given that the main person from this quartet was confused in his testimony and was simply out of his mind. He pretended to be a Franciscan monk, while everyone in his knowledge claimed that he had never been one. However, the other crimes she was involved in were enough to sentence her to life imprisonment. The fact is that those very atrocities directly concerned the inhabitants of Germany, and not Jews from all the countries of the former Reich. We are talking about people who could be freely questioned. They also claimed that Frau Koch was guilty of the deaths of other German citizens, which they witnessed, and now she was no longer pregnant or nursing mother. Her accountant, secretary, stenographer, and camp librarian, all of which were her professions, never turned to be a repeated reality. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in a prison located in the Bavarian town of Jach. For 18 long years, she had to spend the time in conditions for which she did not prepare herself. Too sharp a difference from a mistress who had access to everything to a pathetic real prisoner who had only the right to food, drink, restroom, shower, and a walk in the prison yard. 18 years was her maximum. If we take into account the 2 years before the cancellation of the sentence in 1949, then she had already spent 20 years behind bars. and all those years, the public demanded her execution. Suicide. On September 1st, 1967, Ilse Koch wove a rope from a sheet in order to hang herself in a cell in the same women's prison. On the eve of her death, she complained of 2 illnesses at once, as well as hallucinations. The spirits of the dead prisoners of Buchenwald came to her. Frau Lampshade, in fact, at the age of 60, simply went insane. As you understood, there wasn't enough evidence in the case of the lampshades, and as for those tortured to death, there was no documentary evidence anywhere that Ilse personally took part in or gave orders for murder and torture. She did not have the authority to do so since she was not a warden. But her indirect involvement in the killing and traumatization of people, both physical as well as moral, resulted in a fair life imprisonment, which the spoiled queen could not endure. Unusual harsh conditions, the inability to see her 4 children, and a very heavy guilt did their job. These factors became the executioners of this witch. The executioners who sentenced her for incitement to murder and repeated cruel treatment of prisoners. This phrase appears in the verdict, which collected evidence from 1949 to 1951. That is, in 1951, the Nazi was transferred to isolated cell. In 1971, Ilse Koch's son, Uwe, decided to clear his mother's name. This was the last child born from who knows whom right in prison. He tried to achieve the posthumous rehabilitation of his parent, but he failed to achieve a review of the case. The guy sent a message to the New York Times. He claimed that his mother was a victim of the system. She, as they responded, was guilty, but not in the case of human skin. His efforts went unanswered. Of course, the bodies of many of the hanged SS guards were kicked with particular enthusiasm by a crowd of surviving prisoners and simply witnesses to the execution. Pieces of fabric and buttons were torn off from their clothes for souvenirs. As before, Ilse ordered to let people in for souvenirs. Her name has become a feminine synonym for the atrocities of Nazism, just as Dillewange is a masculine synonym. But it wasn't possible to let her go for souvenirs. However, she ended up receiving a much more terrible punishment. You were watching X War History. Subscribe as well as leave a like, and see you in our upcoming episodes.